Montana Territory, 1875. The wind howled like a lovelorn wolf against the lone cabin nestled at the edge of whispering pines. Beatrice Grayson stood at her bedroom window in Boston, 23 years old and trapped in a gilded cage of societal expectations. Her chestnut hair cascaded down her back as she clutched the latest letter from Preston Drake, a young cowboy she'd never met but whose words had painted the West in colors more vibrant than any Boston sunset. Beatrice smoothed the pale blue fabric of her high-necked dress and read the letter again, tracing her finger over the unrefined penmanship that somehow felt more honest than all the polished words she'd heard from Boston suitors. "No one truly lives out here, Miss Grayson," Preston had written. "We merely survive from one season to the next. The frontier breaks more men than it makes. That is why I write to you, not expecting anything in return, but to remember there is still beauty in this harsh world, even if it remains forever beyond my reach." Beatrice understood survival all too well. Since her parents' death from influenza 3 years prior, she had lived with her aunt, a woman whose sole purpose seemed to be marrying her niece off to secure her own social standing. But Beatrice harbored a belief that had grown like a stubborn weed through the cracks of her proper upbringing. True connection was impossible in a world where marriages were business arrangements. She had witnessed too many loveless unions to believe otherwise. Better to remain alone than to be trapped in a prison of matrimony without affection. What Beatrice truly wanted was simple: control over her own destiny. She had a modest inheritance that would allow her independence if she could escape her aunt's machinations. What she needed, though she would never admit it, was to belong somewhere she could be herself without pretense or performance. She folded Preston's letter and placed it with the others in her keepsake box. For 6 months they had corresponded after she had answered his advertisement in the newspaper, seeking correspondence with a lady of refined sensibilities who might describe the world beyond Montana Territory. Their letters had started formally, then grown increasingly personal. Preston never asked for money, never pressured her, never even suggested meeting. He simply shared his life, the majesty of mountains that scraped the underside of heaven, the punishing winters, the brief glorious summers, and the loneliness of a man who felt at odds with the brutal pragmatism of frontier life. The next morning, Beatrice's life changed with the arrival of a letter from her aunt's solicitor. The inheritance she had counted on would be withheld until her 30th birthday, unless she married. Her aunt had manipulated the terms, ensuring Beatrice would have no choice but to accept one of the suitors already circling like vultures. That evening, as Boston's elite gathered in her aunt's parlor to assess Beatrice like prized cattle, she slipped away to her room and penned a letter to Preston Drake. For the first time, she asked a question that had been forming in her mind for months. Is there room in Montana Territory for a woman who seeks nothing but honest work and the freedom to breathe air unpolluted by pretense? 3 weeks later, his reply arrived with a train ticket and 5 simple words. There is always room for honesty. The journey west transformed Beatrice. Each mile of track carried her farther from the suffocating propriety of Boston society. By the time she reached Helena, Montana Territory in early May 1875, her hands were no longer soft, her traveling dress was stained with coal dust, and her chestnut hair had been hastily pinned beneath a practical bonnet. Yet she felt more herself than she had in years. Preston Drake was nothing like she had imagined. At 26, he stood tall and lean at the train platform, his sandy hair catching the morning light, clean-shaven except for the barest shadow along his jaw. His eyes were the clear blue of mountain lakes, and when they found her, recognition dawned immediately, as though he'd known her all along. He wore no gun belt like many of the other men, just simple work clothes and boots worn at the heels. "Miss Grayson," he said, removing his hat, "welcome to Montana." "Mr. Drake," she replied, trying to calm her racing heart. "I fear I've made a terrible presumption in coming." A small smile lifted one corner of his mouth, no more terrible than my presumption in sending the ticket. As they rode in his wagon toward his small ranch 20 miles outside of town, Beatrice realized how little her imagination had prepared her for the reality of the West. The vastness threatened to swallow her whole. The mountains loomed like silent judges, and the emptiness between homesteads spoke of isolation more profound than any she had experienced in crowded Boston. "It's not what you expected," Preston said, noticing her wide eyes. "Nothing ever is," she replied, "but that doesn't mean it isn't exactly what I need." Preston's ranch was modest, a sturdy cabin, a small barn, corrals, and grazing land that stretched toward distant foothills. Inside the cabin, Beatrice found something unexpected: books. They lined rough shelves along one wall, dog-eared and well-loved. "You didn't mention you were a reader," she said, running her finger along leather spines. "Some things are too precious to entrust to paper and postal carriers," he replied. Then, with careful formality, "I've prepared the lean-to as your quarters. It has its own entrance. Your reputation will remain intact while you decide if the West suits you." That night in the small but clean room adjoining his cabin, Beatrice listened to the unfamiliar sounds of the frontier, and wondered if she had traded one form of isolation for another, more dangerous kind. The following weeks revealed the truth of Preston's letters. He worked from dawn until dusk, tending cattle, mending fences, and coaxing life from the small vegetable garden behind the cabin. He spoke little during the day, but in the evenings, as they sat on the porch watching darkness claim the land, his words would flow like the creek that ran along the eastern edge of his property. "I came west believing I could forge something pure from this wilderness," he told her one evening in late May. "But the land takes more than it gives. Men come with dreams and leave with nightmares, if they leave at all." "Yet you've stayed," Beatrice observed. "I've stayed because leaving would be admitting defeat." He looked at her then, moonlight casting shadows across his face. "The West doesn't forgive weakness." "Perhaps what you see as weakness, others might call humanity," she replied. The first time Beatrice saw Preston's gentle nature was not with her, but with a wounded wolf pup he found while checking his fence line. Rather than killing it, as many would have done, he brought it home, splinted its leg, and built a small pen where it could heal. "The pack will reject it now," Beatrice said, watching him feed the creature with surprising tenderness. "Probably," he agreed, "but everything deserves a chance to find its own way." She understood then that his gruff exterior concealed a heart that refused to harden despite the frontier's best efforts. June brought cattle rustlers to the valley. Preston rode out with other ranchers to track them, leaving Beatrice alone for 3 days. On the second night, a stranger appeared at the cabin door, a man with eyes cold as river stones and a smile that never reached them. "I'm looking for Preston Drake," he said, his hand resting too casually near his holstered gun. "He's gone to town," Beatrice lied, the loaded shotgun Preston had shown her how to use just out of sight behind the door. "That's mighty convenient," the man said. "Mind if I water my horse while I wait?" "I mind very much," she replied, her voice steadier than her hands. "Mr. Drake doesn't welcome uninvited guests." The standoff lasted only moments before the man backed away, but his parting words chilled her. "Tell Drake that Carter hasn't forgotten. 2 years doesn't erase a debt." When Preston returned, victorious but weary from tracking down the rustlers, Beatrice told him about the visitor. The color drained from his face. "Pack your things," he said. "I'm taking you to town tomorrow." "Who is Carter?" she demanded. "A mistake from my past," Preston replied, turning away. "One I won't let touch you." That night, as a summer storm lashed the cabin with rain and wind, Beatrice made tea and placed a cup before Preston, who sat cleaning his rarely used revolver. "In Boston," she said, "men had secrets about business dealings or inappropriate liaisons. Here, secrets seem to carry the scent of gunpowder." Preston's hands stilled. 2 years ago I rode with a man named Carter and his brother on a cattle drive to Cheyenne. There was a dispute over payment. Carter wanted to take what he felt we were owed. I refused. His brother drew on me. Preston's voice dropped. I was faster. "You killed him," Beatrice said, not a question but a confirmation. "It was ruled self-defense, but Carter doesn't accept that verdict. He swore he'd see me hang. And you've been waiting for him ever since." Preston looked up, his eyes haunted. "Every day. That's why I told you the West is no place for more than survival. Anyone who says differently is lying, or hasn't been here long enough. The question hung between them like morning mist, impossible to grasp yet impossible to ignore. I came because your words showed me a man who feels deeply, she finally answered. A man who sees the harshness of this place, yet still finds reasons to continue. Whether those reasons included a gunfight changes nothing. That night Preston moved his bedroll to the porch, determined to guard against Carter's return. Beatrice watched from her window as he settled beneath the stars, his profile silhouetted against the backdrop of mountains. For the first time, she acknowledged the growing warmth in her chest whenever he was near. It wasn't just gratitude or admiration, it was the beginning of something she had never expected to find in this wild place. July brought scorching heat and drought. The creek dwindled to a trickle, and Preston spent long hours driving cattle to water further up in the foothills. Beatrice took over the garden, learning through trial and error how to coax life from the reluctant soil. They developed a rhythm, working separately during the day but finding each other at dusk, when the heat relented enough for conversation. It was during these twilight hours that Beatrice learned Preston's full story, how he had come west at 18, worked cattle drives and mining claims, lost everything in a flood, and finally scraped together enough to buy his small ranch 3 years ago. In turn, she shared her life in Boston, the suffocation of societal expectations, and the fear that had driven her to answer his advertisement. "I never expected you to actually come," he admitted one evening as they shared bread and stew. "My letters were selfish, a way to remember there was a world beyond this valley." "Then we used each other equally," she replied with a small smile. "For I never intended to answer a stranger's advertisement until I found myself with no other acceptable options." Preston laughed then, a rare sound that transformed his face, softening the lines worry had etched around his eyes. "We make quite the pair of desperate souls, Miss Grayson." "Beatrice," she corrected. "After 2 months of sharing your home, I think formality is rather pointless." "Beatrice," he repeated, her name sounding different in his voice, like a prayer or a promise. The moment shattered with the distant crack of a rifle. Preston was on his feet instantly, pulling Beatrice down behind the table as a second shot splintered the cabin's window. "Carter," he said grimly, reaching for his revolver. "You don't know that," she whispered, her heart pounding. "I know." Preston crawled to the window and peered out cautiously. "Stay down. When I go out, bar the door behind me. You cannot simply walk out there, he'll kill you." Preston turned to her, his expression calm in a way that terrified her more than the gunshots. "I won't let him hunt us, this ends tonight." Before she could protest further, he was gone, slipping out the back door into the gathering darkness. Beatrice stood frozen, then ran to the rifle Preston kept above the fireplace. Her father had taught her to shoot, though Boston society would have been scandalized to know it. With trembling hands, she checked that it was loaded. Outside, Preston's voice carried clearly, "Show yourself, Carter. This is between you and me." A laugh answered from the darkness near the corral. "Seems you've done well for yourself, Drake. Nice little ranch, pretty woman. Lot to lose now." Beatrice moved to the window, trying to locate the voice. In the fading light, she could just make out Preston standing in the open yard, exposed and vulnerable. "Your brother drew first," Preston called. "You know it's true." "Don't matter what's true," Carter replied. "Only matters what I believe. And I believe you owe me a life." The shot came without warning. Beatrice saw Preston stagger, clutching his shoulder, as Carter emerged from the shadows, rifle raised for a second shot. Without thinking, she threw open the door and fired. The rifle's recoil slammed into her shoulder, but her aim was true enough to send Carter diving for cover. "Get back inside," Preston shouted, but Beatrice was already running toward him, helping him to the shelter of the barn as Carter's bullets kicked up dust around them. Inside the barn, Preston slumped against a stall. "You shouldn't have come out," he gasped as she tore strips from her petticoat to bind his bleeding shoulder. "And you shouldn't have faced him alone," she retorted, tying the makeshift bandage tight. "Is this how Western men prove themselves? By dying unnecessarily?" A shadow fell across the barn door. "Touching scene," Carter drawled, his rifle aimed at them both. the Eastern lady and the coward who hides behind her skirts. Beatrice felt Preston tense beside her, ready to lunge despite his wound. She grabbed his arm, holding him back. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice steady despite her fear, "I understand you believe you're owed justice for your brother, but killing Preston won't bring him back, and it will hang you just as surely." Carter's laugh was hollow. "Lady, you don't know the first thing about frontier justice. Out here, a man makes his own." The crack of a pistol cut him off. Carter jerked, his rifle clattering to the ground as he clutched his arm. Behind him stood Sheriff Mills, revolver still raised. "That's enough, Carter," the sheriff said. "Drop the gun and back away." What followed was a blur to Beatrice. The sheriff taking Carter away, the doctor being summoned from town, Preston's wound being properly cleaned and stitched. By dawn, she sat beside his bed, watching his chest rise and fall with steady breaths. "Why did you come out?" he asked when he finally woke, his voice ragged. "He could have killed you." Beatrice took his hand, no longer concerned with propriety. "For the same reason you went out to face him, because some things are worth risking everything for." Preston's recovery through August revealed a shift in their relationship. The pretense of employer and boarder dissolved as Beatrice tended his wound, managed the ranch chores, and slept in the chair beside his bed. When he was strong enough to sit on the porch, they watched summer thunderstorms roll across the valley, shoulders touching, hands occasionally finding each other in the darkness. "I always believed the frontier only allowed for survival," Preston said one evening as lightning illuminated the distant mountains. "That anything more would be stripped away by the harshness of this place." "And now," Beatrice asked, her heart quickening, "now I wonder if survival alone is enough reason to continue." His eyes met hers. "If I hadn't written those letters, if you hadn't come west." "But you did, and I did," she said simply. September brought cooler temperatures and a revelation that shattered everything they had built. A letter arrived from Boston. Beatrice's aunt had died suddenly, leaving her entire fortune to her niece without conditions. Beatrice could return east as a wealthy woman, free to live as she chose. Preston found her by the creek that evening, the letter clutched in her hand. "Congratulations," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "You've gotten what you wanted, freedom on your own terms." "Is that all you think I wanted?" she asked. "Isn't it? You came west to escape, Beatrice. Now you can return on your own terms without having to answer to anyone." She stood, anger flaring. "Is that what you believe? That I would simply leave now that I have money, that these months have meant nothing?" "I believe the West is no place for a woman of means and education," he said stiffly. "I believe you deserve more than a struggling ranch and a man with blood on his hands." "Then you are a coward, Preston Drake," she said, tears threatening. "Not because you faced Carter, but because you refused to face what's grown between us." He flinched as if she'd struck him. "I'm trying to give you the freedom to choose. By pushing me away, that's not offering freedom, that's making the choice for me." She stepped closer. "My aunt's money changes nothing about what I want." "And what is that?" he asked, his voice barely audible above the creek's gentle murmur. "A life where I am seen for who I truly am, a place where I belong." She took his hand and placed it over her heart. "I found both the moment I stepped off that train." The revelation hit Preston with the force of a physical blow. His carefully constructed walls, built from years of believing the frontier allowed for nothing but harsh pragmatism, began to crumble. If this woman, who could have anything she wanted, chose him and this difficult life, perhaps his understanding of what was possible had been wrong all along. Before he could respond, hoofbeats thundered into the yard. Sheriff Mills dismounted, his expression grim. "Carter escaped custody this morning, killed a deputy and took his gun." He glanced between them. "He was heard saying he had unfinished business with Drake." Preston's face hardened. "How long do we have?" "Not long, I've got men searching, but—" The sheriff shook his head. "You should both come to town where I can protect you." "This is my home," Preston said firmly. "I won't be driven from it." After the sheriff left to continue his search, Preston turned to Beatrice. "Pack your things. I'm taking you to town." "No." Beatrice, this isn't a discussion. Carter won't stop until one of us is dead. Then we face him together, she insisted. I won't leave you alone, not now. I can't protect you and fight him, Preston argued, desperation edging his voice. You still don't understand, she said softly. I don't need your protection, I need your trust. Your belief that together we are stronger than apart. That night they prepared for Carter's arrival. Preston cleaned his revolver while Beatrice loaded the rifle and placed it near the window. They moved furniture to create barriers, filled buckets of water in case of fire, and planned escape routes if the cabin became indefensible. In the stillness before dawn, Preston found Beatrice at the kitchen table, writing by lamplight. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Writing to the bank in Boston about my inheritance," she replied without looking up. "I'm establishing an account here in Montana Territory." Preston sat across from her. "Beatrice, if something happens to me—" "Don't," she interrupted. "We will both survive this." "But if we don't," he pressed, "I need you to know that my letters may have brought you west, but your strength, your courage, your refusal to accept the world as it is instead of as it could be. That's what made me see beyond mere survival for the first time since I came to this territory." Beatrice set down her pen and met his gaze. "Then we have given each other the same gift." The attack came not with gunfire but with flames. Shortly before sunrise, they smelled smoke and discovered the barn ablaze. As Preston ran to save the horses, Carter emerged from behind the well, gun drawn. "Predictable as sunrise, Drake," he called. "Always the soft heart under that hard shell." Preston froze, caught in the open with no cover. Behind Carter, Beatrice appeared in the cabin doorway, rifle raised. Carter sensed her presence and spun, firing wildly as Preston drew his own weapon. 2 shots rang out almost simultaneously. Carter fell, a bloom of red spreading across his chest. Preston staggered, dropping to one knee as blood soaked through his shirt just below his ribs. "Preston!" Beatrice screamed, running to him as he collapsed. She pressed her hands to the wound, trying to stem the bleeding. "Stay with me, please, stay with me." His eyes found hers, clouded with pain but still clear enough to see her. "Beatrice, I was wrong. The West isn't just for surviving, it's for living, if you have someone to live for." "Then live for me," she begged, tears falling onto his face. "Live with me." The next hours stretched into an eternity as Beatrice fought to keep Preston alive. She managed to get him into the cabin, away from the burning barn. She cleaned and bandaged his wound as best she could, praying the bullet had missed vital organs. When he burned with fever, she bathed his forehead with cool water. When he thrashed in delirium, she held him still, whispering promises of a future together. Sheriff Mills found them the next day, alerted by the smoke from the still smoldering barn. The doctor came, extracted the bullet, and gave Preston even odds of survival. "If infection doesn't set in," he cautioned, "he might pull through, but it'll be touch and go for days." For a week, Beatrice barely left Preston's side. She slept in snatches, ate only when neighbors who came to help insisted, and prayed with a fervor that surprised her, having abandoned formal religion years before. On the 7th night, Preston's fever broke. When he opened his eyes, clear and present for the first time in days, Beatrice wept with relief. "You stayed," he whispered, his voice weak but steady. "Always," she replied. October painted the valley in gold and crimson as Preston slowly regained his strength. The community rallied around them, helping rebuild the barn before winter set in. Beatrice's inheritance arrived, and she used part of it to purchase adjacent land, doubling the size of the ranch. Together they planned expansions, more cattle, better fencing, perhaps a larger cabin in time. On the first truly cold evening of autumn, as frost crystallized on the windows and a fire crackled in the hearth, Preston took Beatrice's hand across the table they now shared as equals. "I came west believing I could only survive here, never truly live," he said. "I wrote those letters to remind myself that somewhere beauty and gentleness still existed, even if I could never claim them for myself." "And now," she asked, the question echoing their conversation from months before. "Now I know that survival without connection is no life at all." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a simple gold band. "I don't have much to offer except this land, my name, and the promise that I will spend every day trying to be worthy of you." Beatrice looked at the ring, then at the man before her, no longer the guarded cowboy who had met her at the train station, but a partner who had learned that vulnerability was not weakness but the deepest kind of strength. "Your letters may have brought me west," she said, extending her hand to him, "but your gentle heart is what made me stay." They married in November, a small ceremony in the newly rebuilt barn, decorated with pine boughs and late-blooming wildflowers Beatrice had pressed between Bible pages. The community that had once viewed Preston as a solitary figure now embraced them both, filling the space with laughter and music that continued long into the night. That winter was harsh, with snowdrifts higher than the corral fences and temperatures that froze breath in the air. But inside their cabin, Beatrice and Preston created warmth that defied the Montana cold. They read to each other from his collection of books, expanded now with volumes she had ordered from back east. They planned for spring planting, for cattle to calve, for a future neither had dared imagine before. On Christmas morning, as the sun turned the snow-covered landscape into a sea of diamonds, Preston gave Beatrice a handcrafted desk positioned by the window with the best view of the mountains. "For your writing," he explained. "Your letters to Boston showed me how beautifully you capture this place. It's where I learned to live because of you." As darkness settled over the valley they now shared, Beatrice thought of the journey that had brought her here, from a sheltered Boston existence to this wild, magnificent life on the frontier. Preston's letters had indeed brought her west, offering escape from a life of hollow propriety. But it was his gentle heart, revealed not in grand gestures but in daily kindnesses, in his care for injured creatures, in his refusal to harden despite the frontier's demands, in his willingness to see her as an equal partner, that had made her stay. Together they had discovered that the truest frontier wasn't the untamed wilderness around them, but the courage to build a life where love thrived despite every hardship. In each other they had found not just a home, but a promise that even in the wildest places, the human heart could still find its way to belonging.